Every 3D Zelda game did something that changed the franchise forever. From Ocarina of Time inventing lock-on targeting, to Breath of the Wild burning the entire formula to the ground, each one took a massive swing. Today, I'm ranking all 7 from worst to best, and explaining exactly what makes each one tick. Starting with the game that bet everything on a single gimmick, Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is the boldest gamble Nintendo ever made with the Zelda franchise, and depending on who you ask, it was either a stroke of genius or a complete disaster. There is zero middle ground with this game. Released in 2011 for the Wii, the entire thing was built around Wii Motion Plus. Every sword slash, every puzzle, every enemy encounter required you to physically swing the remote in the correct direction. Chua vertical slash for a vertically guarded enemy. Horizontal for horizontal. The game literally would not let you button mash your way through anything. Here's the thing. When it worked, it genuinely felt incredible. Landing a perfectly angled strike on a Stalfos that's actively shifting its guard feels like nothing else in the series. But when it didn't work, it was miserable. Calibration drift, imprecise tracking, and genuine arm fatigue turned epic boss fights into wrestling matches with your own controller, which is, not ideal. The 2021 Switch remaster acknowledged this divide by mapping sword swings to the right analog stick, essentially admitting the original vision didn't land for everyone without completely abandoning it. A diplomatic move, if nothing else. Beyond the control controversy, Skyward Sword carries massive narrative weight. This is chronologically the earliest adventure in the entire Zelda timeline. The origin of the Master Sword, the creation of the surface world that would become Hyrule, the establishment of the eternal cycle binding Link and Zelda to the Demon King's curse across every incarnation. That's not filler lore. That's the foundation of everything. Visually, the game split the difference between Twilight Princess realism and Wind Waker cell shading, landing on this painterly, impressionistic look that aged better than the Wii hardware had any right to produce. But none of that changes the core problem, when your entire game lives or dies by one mechanic, and that mechanic works for maybe 60% of your audience. You've created something permanently polarizing. A game with the most important story in the franchise, wrapped in the most divisive controls in the franchise. If you think that's a rough start, wait until we talk about a game that turned the entire world into an ocean and made everyone sail through it. Majora's Mask. You just made the highest rated game of all time. Critics are calling it a masterpiece. Fans are losing their minds. So what do you do for the follow-up? Apparently, you make a game about depression, death, and a giant moon with a face that wants to kill everyone, which is, not ideal for a sequel strategy. Majora's Mask dropped in 2000, just 2 years after Ocarina of Time, and it immediately made one thing clear. It had zero interest in being Ocarina of Time. No Hyrule, no Ganon, no familiar safety net. Instead, Nintendo threw players into Termina, onto a doomed world where the moon is literally falling out of the sky, and you have exactly 72 in-game hours to stop it. A countdown to annihilation. Here's where it gets complicated. Those 72 hours aren't just a gimmick. They structure everything. The Song of Time resets the entire world back to dawn of the first day, wiping most of your progress. The inverted Song of Time slows the clock. The Song of Double Time jumps you forward. Every activity has to be planned with surgical precision because the clock never stops ticking. You're not exploring at your leisure. You're triaging a dying world. And then there are the masks. 4 transformation masks gave Link completely different forms. Deku Scrub for flight, Goron for rolling across lava, Zora for underwater combat, and the Fierce Deity, which basically turned Link into a god of destruction. Now, putting on the Goron mask meant you were playing a different game. The initial reception? Mixed. A lot of players found the time limit genuinely stressful, and the departure from Ocarina's formula felt alienating. People wanted more Hyrule. What they got was existential dread and a grotesque moon staring them down every time they looked at the sky. That image alone became one of the most unsettling visuals in the entire franchise. But here's the thing. Over the next 2 decades, something shifted. Players who bounced off the game originally started coming back, and they found something deeper than they expected. The whole game is about mortality, about acceptance, about watching people live their final days, and choosing whether to help them, even though the clock resets and they'll forget you ever exist. That kind of emotional weight doesn't hit you at 12 years old. It hits you at 25, when you've actually lost something. The 3DS remake in 2015 polished up the visuals, but even cleaned up, Majora's Mask remains the weird one, the black sheep, the game that was too strange for its own era, and had to wait for the world to catch up. And honestly, that might be why it's so beloved now. It didn't try to be what people wanted. It tried to be something they didn't know they needed. But if Majora's Mask made people uncomfortable with its tone, wait until you see what happened when Nintendo made people uncomfortable with an art style. Twilight Princess, after Wind Waker divided the fanbase with its cartoon aesthetic, Nintendo looked at the community feedback and said, alright, you want dark? We'll give you dark. And they were not kidding. Twilight Princess launched in 2006 for both the Wii and GameCube, and it swung the creative pendulum so hard in the opposite direction that it practically gave itself a whiplash. Where Wind Waker was bright, expressive, and playful, Twilight Princess was muted earth tones, shadow-drenched environments, and realistic character proportions. This was Zelda for the kids who grew up on Ocarina of Time and wanted something that grew up with them. But the real genius of this game isn't the aesthetic, it's the wolf. When the twilight engulfs Link, he doesn't just get a cool new outfit. His entire body transforms into a blue-eyed wolf, retaining only his piercing gaze and the Triforce mark on his paw. And this isn't some temporary mask you throw on for one dungeon. For significant portions of the game, you are the wolf. The wolf form came loaded with mechanics that made it feel genuinely distinct from human Link. Superior speed, the ability to dig through soil to access hidden areas, leaping great distances, and a sense ability that let you track scents and see hidden spirits. You weren't just playing the same game with a different skin, you were playing a fundamentally different game. And here's where the design gets quietly brilliant. The developers built dual-layer level design, where the exact same physical spaces played completely differently depending on your form. Take Kakariko Village, show up as the wolf early in the game, and the place is smothered in twilight, tense, hostile, dangerous. Come back as human Link once the light is restored, and the village opens up with NPCs, shops, and quest interactions. Same geometry. Two entirely different experiences. Nobody talks about this enough. The parallel worlds reinforced all of it thematically. Hyrule existed in sunlight. The Twilight Realm existed in perpetual shadow. Light versus darkness wasn't just a story beat. It was baked into every visual choice the game made. Now, the Wii version. The motion controls became a genuine point of contention. Some players loved the physicality. Others found it imprecise, fatiguing, and honestly a little goofy when you're trying to have a serious emotional moment and your arm is getting tired. The GameCube version with traditional controls existed as an alternative, but most people experienced the Wii version first, which colored the game's legacy in ways that weren't entirely fair. Worth noting, the Wii version actually mirrored the entire game world to make Link right-handed, meaning the two versions of Hyrule are literal mirror images of each other. Twilight Princess received critical acclaim and still sits comfortably among the strongest entries in the franchise. The extended tutorial drew criticism for holding the player's hand too long, which, fair. But once the game opens up, the dungeon design, the atmosphere, and the sheer ambition of building two gameplay experiences into one world make it something special. But if you think emotion controls were controversial here, wait until you see the game that built its entire identity around them, The Wind Waker. In December 2002, Nintendo looked at an entire industry sprinting toward photorealism and said, nah, we're making a cartoon. And the internet lost its mind. Here's the thing about The Wind Waker. It might be the single most vindicated creative decision in gaming history. When the first trailer dropped at Space World 2001, forums erupted. Players who grew up with Ocarina of Time's darker, grittier Hyrule felt genuinely betrayed. They wanted the next evolution of realistic Link. Instead, they got a wide-eyed cartoon child with a head the size of a watermelon. The backlash was immediate, loud, and, as it turns out, completely wrong, because the CL shading wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was an engineering flex disguised as a children's book. The GameCube was a capable piece of hardware, so this wasn't a case of limitations forcing a simpler look. The developers deliberately chose a tuned shading pipeline that crushed smooth gradients into discrete color steps. The result looked like a hand-painted illustration running in real time. Every single element in the game, from Link's tunic to the ocean waves, was built to maintain that illusion. The engine even altered color and lighting dynamically, shifting island palettes based on weather and time of day, replacing standard highlights with vivid, saturated tones during storms. That's not a shortcut. That's obsession. And here's where it gets interesting. The cartoon look wasn't just pretty, it was mechanically superior. Link's exaggerated proportions meant his facial expressions and body language communicated emotions and puzzle logic with zero ambiguity. You could read his reactions from across the room. The bold outlines created silhouettes that stayed readable at any distance, which meant navigating the open ocean never turned into a squinting contest the way naturalistic textures from that era absolutely would have. The art style was doing gameplay work that nobody appreciated at the time. Speaking of that ocean, The Wind Waker handed you a sentient boat called the King of Red Lions and a vast sea chart containing 49 explorable squares, most of which were blank when you started. The rest? Go find them yourself. Sail in any direction. Pick an island. See what happens. This was proto-open world design years before the term existed, and the sheer freedom of charting your own course across that massive ocean gave the game a sense of discovery that most titles from 2002 couldn't touch. The Toon Link design went on to appear in multiple crossover games, and the cel-shaded aesthetic directly influenced subsequent Zelda titles like Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Track. Beyond the franchise, you can trace Wind Waker's visual philosophy into the broader wave of stylized games that followed in the years after. It proved that stylization ages better than realism, which is exactly why Wind Waker screenshots from 2002 still look gorgeous while its photorealistic contemporaries look like they were rendered on a toaster. Every game from that era chased graphical fidelity. Wind Waker chased artistic identity. And over 20 years later, it's the one that still looks timeless. But if you think bold art direction was controversial, wait until you see what happened when Nintendo swung the pendulum all the way back toward darkness. Ocarina of Time November 21st, 1998. That's the date the entire action-adventure genre got rewritten by a single Nintendo 64 cartridge. And I don't mean that in the way people casually throw around this game changed everything. I mean, Ocarina of Time literally invented mechanics that developers are still using today, nearly 3 decades later. Every 3D action game you've ever played owes something to this one, and I can prove it. Let's start with the big one, Z-targeting. Before Ocarina of Time, fighting enemies in a 3D game was like trying to have a sword fight in a dark room while someone kept spinning the camera around. Every developer was struggling with the same problem. How do you make combat feel precise when the player can't even see what they're swinging at? Nintendo's answer was devastatingly simple. You press Z, the camera locks onto the enemy, centers itself behind Link, and suddenly you can strafe, dodge, and duel like it's an actual fight. One button. That's all it took to solve a problem the entire industry had been failing at for years. Here's the thing. It wasn't just a nice feature. It became the feature. Virtually every action-adventure game released after 1998 adopted some form of lock-on targeting. Dark Souls, God of War, Elden Ring, all of them traced their combat camera philosophy back to a Hylian kid on the N64. That's not influence, that's a blueprint. But Z-targeting alone doesn't explain why this game still sits at the top of Metacritic as the highest rated video game ever recorded. That part comes down to everything else. The dungeon design set a gold standard that the franchise itself spent decades trying to match. Intricate layouts with multiple paths, not interconnected puzzle chambers where solving one room changes the geometry of 3 others. Boss fights that tested every tool you'd collected. It was architectural storytelling before anyone had a word for it. Then there's the music. Koji Kondo composed distinct themes for every major location in Hyrule, and each one hit differently. Stepping into Kokiri Forest felt like coming home. Entering the Shadow Temple felt like a mistake. The soundtrack didn't just accompany the game, it was the game. Players who haven't touched Ocarina in 20 years can still hum Zelda's lullaby from memory, which is, kind of the point. The game moved 7.6 million copies on the N64 alone, making it the best-selling Zelda entry of its generation, and one of the most commercially dominant games of the late 90s. And when Nintendo released the 3DS remaster in 2011, they updated the visuals and lighting without touching the original artistic vision. Smart move, because unlike games from that era, chasing photorealism with textures that look like melted cheese by modern standards, Ocarina's stylized approach aged gracefully. The remaster just polished what was already clean. There's a reason this game consistently tops greatest of all time lists, and it's not nostalgia goggles. It's that Ocarina of Time didn't just make a great Zelda game. It proved that a 2D franchise could survive the jump to 3D and come out the other side greater than it ever was. It wrote the language that every 3D action-adventure game still speaks, but even the greatest game ever made has competition. And the next 2 entries on this list, they tried to dethrone it. Breath of the Wild. Here's the thing about Breath of the Wild. Nintendo had a formula that worked. 30 years of critical acclaim, commercial success, and universal adoration. Dungeon progression, item gating, linear storytelling, bulletproof, and in 2017, they looked at all of it, said no thanks, and burned it to the ground. And it might be the smartest decision any game studio has ever made. Breath of the Wild launched on March 3rd, 2017 as a Switch launch title, and simultaneously as the Wii U's final major release. And it didn't just change Zelda, it changed what every open-world game after it had to be. Game of the Year from basically everyone with a microphone and an opinion. But the awards aren't the interesting part. The interesting part is how one single mechanic demolished an entire genre's worth of assumption. Link can climb anything, any surface, any wall, any cliff face, any random rock formation you point at and think, I wonder if I can get up there. The answer is yes. As long as you have the stamina, you can climb it. That one decision, which sounds almost stupidly simple on paper, eliminated every artificial barrier open-world games had relied on for decades. No invisible walls. No conveniently placed waist-high fences blocking a mountain. You see a peak, you climb it. Players could approach any objective from literally any direction. Want to follow the road like a normal person? Sure. Want to scale a sheer cliff face in a thunderstorm because you're impatient? Also sure. The game didn't care how you got there. It cared that you got there on your own terms. But the climbing isn't even the secret weapon. The puzzle design is. The Sheikah Slate gave you core rune abilities early on. Remote bombs, Magnesis for manipulating metal objects, Cryonis for creating ice pillars on water, and Stasis for freezing objects and storing kinetic energy. Here's what's critical. You never replaced them. They never became obsolete. These runes were your toolkit from the Great Plateau to the final boss, and the game trusted you to figure out how to use them. Because of that trust, every puzzle had multiple correct solutions. Fire creates updrafts for paragliding. Ice pillars bridge gaps. Explosive barrels become improvised tools. Some guy named Cornelius on the internet solved a shrine by launching himself off a catapult made of stasis frozen object. That wasn't a bug. That was the point. And the game built mechanical playgrounds and said figure it out. The world itself taught you what to do. No quest markers screaming from the minimap. No glowing breadcrumb trails. You'd see a strange rock formation and think that looks important. You'd spot a distant glow and walk toward it because your brain said so. not because an objective marker told you to. Bold outlines, distinct color separation, careful composition that maintained legibility across a world this massive, clarity over photorealism every single time, and the ripple effect went far beyond Zelda. Developers across the industry watched Breath of the Wild succeed and collectively realized they needed to rethink everything. The linear open world, the one where you technically had freedom but practically followed a guided tour, suddenly felt outdated overnight. Player freedom wasn't a nice bonus anymore. It was the expectation. Nintendo took a franchise that was still printing money and tore it apart because they believed they could build something better from scratch, which is, either visionary or clinically insane. Turns out it was the first one. But if Breath of the Wild redefined what Zelda could be, the next game asked an even crazier question. What happens when you let the player build whatever they want? Tears of the Kingdom. Nintendo looked at the most revolutionary open world ever made and asked the single dumbest question in game development history. What if we let the player build in it? And somehow, that was the right call. Tears of the Kingdom released in May 2023 as a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, which meant it faced the one challenge nobody envies. How do you follow up a game that changed everything? You can't just give players more map. You can't just add a new story and call it a day. You need to fundamentally expand what's possible. And Nintendo's answer was to hand players a construction kit with nearly infinite creative possibilities, then sit back and watch the chaos unfold. The centerpiece of everything is Ultra Hand. This single ability let Link lift, move, rotate, and attach virtually any loose object together. That's it. That's the pitch. And from that one mechanic, players built functioning helicopters, multi-stage rockets, walking mechs, bridges, and contraptions so absurd they looked like they belonged in a completely different game. Someone built a working bomber plane. Someone else made a self-driving car. I don't know what to tell you. People are unhinged when you give them tools. But Ultra Hand wasn't just a sandbox toy. The story's themes of cooperation and connection translated directly into the mechanics of joining objects together. The narrative and the gameplay were saying the same thing at the same time. That's ludonarrative resonance, and most games can't even spell it, let alone achieve it. Then there's Fuse, Nintendo's elegant answer to Breath of the Wild's single biggest criticism. Weapon durability drove people insane in the first game. Weapons shattered like they were made of wet cardboard. Fuse let players attach materials to weapons, shields, and arrows, creating custom equipment that actually felt worth using. Stick a key's eyeball on an arrow, homing projectile. Fuse a ruby onto a shield, fire burst when you block. The system turned weapon management from a frustration into a creative exercise. Recall reverse the movement of any object through time, which sounds simple, until you realize it turns falling debris into elevators. Ascend let Link phase straight up through solid ceilings to reach areas that would otherwise require 10 minutes of climbing. Both abilities expanded traversal so dramatically that going back to Breath of the Wild afterwards feels like someone took your legs away. And then there's the depths. A vast underground system spanning the entire map, mirroring the surface world above it. This effectively tripled the explorable space when you count the sky islands above, not with copy-pasted filler, but with genuine darkness, gloom-infected enemies far more dangerous than anything on the surface, and an atmosphere that made every step feel like a risk. Hyrule literally had a second Hyrule underneath it, and floating islands above it the whole time. The game also introduced Zonai devices, prefabricated technology pieces like fans, rockets, wheels, and steering sticks dispensed from capsule machines across the world. These were the building blocks that turned Ultra Hand from a neat trick into a full engineering sandbox. Without them, nobody's building a flying death machine out of sticks and rock. 25 years of 3D Zelda experimentation led here. Ocarina of Time invented the language. Majora's Mask bent it. Wind Waker painted it. Twilight Princess darkened it. Skyward Sword swung it around a living room. Breath of the Wild burned the rulebook. And Tears of the Kingdom looked at the ashes and said, now build something. Every game on this list pushed the franchise forward in ways that seemed impossible at the time. But Tears of the Kingdom is the one that took everything the series learned and handed the tools directly to the player. That's not just a sequel. That's the culmination. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.